This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, the podcast that has everything to do with digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of change. My name is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
As always, of course. And we've got a great show for you today. Before I jump into the agenda for today's episode, just a real quick reminder that we have new episodes of this show every Wednesday, which you can find on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all of the audio podcast platforms, whichever podcast platform you might listen to podcasts on, you can find us there. So just look up Transformation Ground Control. You'll find us there. This is episode number 77, where we've got three great topics for you today. We're going to start off with some hot topics in the first segment. We'll talk about why Bluetooth has failed. And Bluetooth fails me on a daily basis, so I can definitely commiserate with that. Look forward to that part of the conversation. We'll talk about climate change in the global shipping industry, the future of bots in automation, and there will be some Elon Musk and Twitter shout-outs as a result of the discussion being focused on bots. And Elon Musk obviously is triggered by the idea of bots as it relates to Twitter. So we'll touch on that topic later in the show. And then we'll also talk about post-tech purchase regret as well in those hot topics. So that'll be the opening segment that we get to here in just a moment. And then later in the show, we are going to have Lisa Pope, who is the CEO, or I'm sorry, she's the president. I have to make sure I get her title right this time. She's the president of Epicor Software. And Epicor Software is one of the leading ERP software providers in the market. And she's going to be on the show, and we are going to discuss the past, present, and future of ERP software. So we're going to touch on sort of how ERP software has evolved, how businesses have evolved in their needs for ERP systems. And then we'll also talk about the future and sort of where that space is headed, that the ERP software space is headed. So stay tuned for that. She's a great guest, and it's her first time on the show, so we're really looking forward to that. And then later in the show, we are going to play a clip of a presentation that I gave at our recent Digital Stratosphere event, which was for the Asia Pacific market. But this particular topic is something that's relevant to a global audience, and so we wanted to play you a clip from that regional event. And the topic is going to be on executive alignment. So I give a presentation on executive alignment and how it fits into an organizational change strategy and an overall digital transformation strategy and roadmap. So if that's something that's of interest to you, and you're not sure how to get executive alignment, you're not sure if you're aligned as an organization, it's a good presentation to help you unpack that a bit more. So stay tuned for that. And that's what we've got covered for you today. But before we dive into our guests and some of our meatier topics later in the show, what are some of these hot topics you've got for us, Kyler?
Yeah, well, let's start with the Elon Musk Twitter saga. So the backstory, if you don't know it, Elon Musk offered a multi-billion-dollar deal to buy the majority shares of Twitter. So essentially, that would mean that he owned and operated Twitter, the social media platform that's based here in the United States. Going through the process, Elon Musk wanted to make sure that the platform was authentic, a freedom of speech opportunity. And by doing that, he wanted to see how many bot platforms, or profiles, I should say, are actually on the platform. So they did a data analysis, Twitter did, and said 5% of our profiles are bots. Elon Musk didn't believe them, did his own data analysis, said they aren't giving him access to all of that information to assess what they essentially sold him. So now he is attempting to back out of the deal. And that's really the the meat of this argument is, can he back out of the deal because of that fake profile ratio? So what I thought we could chat about as a product of this is just the evolution of bots on platforms, whether it's social media or whether it's the use of other automation, and just the overall disruption that Elon Musk has now created in the marketplace around Twitter and the distrust of these bot profiles. And we've all had experience with bot profiles in social media, but it's also a huge business tool in automation, whether you're using it for email marketing, whether you're automating messaging with customers on your website. It has many different uses. So I wanted to get your opinion, Eric, because I feel like you think a lot like Elon Musk as a disruptor in the industry, as someone who's, not afraid to say we shouldn't do it this way, or we should be more authentic with our customers, with our users, with our organizations. What are your thoughts on the future of bot technology when it comes to communicating throughout organizations, both internally and externally?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about Elon Musk, and just sort of a sidebar note that I haven't even shared with you yet, but right before we started filming this episode, I got an email from Inc. Magazine, and Inc. Magazine, which you do already know, has included us, or is including Third Stage Consulting in the 5,000, the Inc. 5,000, one of the fastest growing companies in the world. And so we're going to be featured in that Inc. 5000 here when that issue comes out later this year. But the reason they reached out to me today was because I had done a survey, like they surveyed all the CEOs of these companies that made the list of the fastest growing companies in the world. And one of the quotes that they asked if they could use was me talking about Elon Musk. So it's funny you say that, because I said that, they ask like what entrepreneur you most respect or something like that, or that you most look up to, or whatever. I can't remember the exact words, but something along those lines. And I said it was Elon Musk because he's unfiltered and he is engaged in some pretty disruptive businesses and some emerging groundbreaking businesses. So yes, I'm somewhat flattered that you would say I think like Elon Musk, because I admire him a lot. But back to your question though about bots, though, I think that bots absolutely have an important role to play in organizations. I think the problem with Twitter is that it, as you sort of alluded to, is that it creates this inauthentic sort of user experience in social media. Social media is probably not the best place to be using bots, although we use bots. We use automated software to post some of the stuff that we post very consistently on social media. So I have to tread lightly here, because on one hand, I think it can create a lack of authenticity, but if you overdo it, but it can also help create more consistency, more efficiency, and that sort of thing. So I think finding that right balance is important. And there's a lot of industries that have a lot to gain from bots. So, we've all been on the websites where you could chat with a bot. I think the technology has a long ways to go to be more effective, because I think we've all been frustrated by trying to type something in the chat, and the chat doesn't seem to recognize, or the bot doesn't seem to recognize what you're trying to say. But I think that'll evolve over time. And I think certainly when you look at like RPA, like robotic process automation, and some of the, what's that called? There's the type of technology where you will take like a manual paper form, and it can scan in different fields from that paper form. I can't remember what the technology is called, intelligent automation or something like that, where you like insurance companies, or you think about when you apply for a mortgage to buy a house, you fill out all this paper, the physical paper, and then it gets scanned into a computer, and then a bot will sort of codify all that in standard ways. So I think there's a lot of really groundbreaking efficiencies that can be gained by that technology. But I think the problem with Twitter is that it, like I said, it probably takes it a little too far, too much automation, too much of a bot feel. And that's what I think Elon Musk is concerned about, is that that's not, creating a sticky environment. Plus, not to mention the fact that Twitter was counting those bots as real users. And I think that was the real problem he had, is, you look at the numbers and it didn't add up from that regard.
So do you think that he's going to be able to get out of the sale?
Well, I think he's already, he just recently, I think in the last couple weeks terminated it. It said he's terminated the purchase. The question, I think, is whether or not Twitter's board actually sues him. And I think their discussions or the rumor is that they are considering filing legal action against him for breach of contract or whatever the legal term is. So I think he can, but I just don't know if that'll turn into a legal mess for him or a legal battle. That's still to be determined, I suppose.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of the nature of social media meeting the kind of the compliance or regulation side, which we've seen be a topic of conversation on those public platforms and banding profiles and monitoring speech, those types of things, which also uses technology like automations and AI to on the back end to flag those types of accounts. So definitely a really interesting balance, and we'll keep an eye on it. And if you talk to Elon, you let us know what his plans are.
Well, we have the standing offer to Elon Musk to be on the show. I have actually tweeted to him saying, hey, Elon, you should be on the show. I have not heard back yet, which I'm totally surprised by because I'm pretty sure he has to listen to the show. I mean, who wouldn't?
100%.
So, well, we'll see. Well, if anyone has connections with Elon Musk, we'd love to have him on the show. So
absolutely,
be sure to message us after the show.
Well, that's a good segue into one of the other hot topics where kind of legislation is actually in front of technology, which rarely happens. So we're talking about climate change and the global shipping industry. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is kind of a battle between the United Nations leg of the shipping industry and climate change legislation, specifically in American port cities. For example, LA has a zero net emissions legislation by 2030. And as a supply chain expert, I wanted to get your opinion on that, because just to lay out some of the barriers to those different technologies when it comes to things like biofuel, we look at batteries are not strong enough for heavy shipping tanker boats type of thing. And then we also look at the high demand of biofuels in other industries because of these really green initiatives across the world. And then we also look at, when we talk about green hydrogen, which tends to be the energy that climate initiatives focus on, the storage of that is very dangerous and it's extremely expensive to produce. So I wanted to just get your feedback on, are we, as a global society, and our intentions are pure, to save the planet, is the shipping industry, the supply chain, going to be able to keep up with those regulatory barriers? So by saying things like 2030, 2035, is that dangerous, and is that potentially going to derail a lot of supply chains and different organizations that rely on those larger global shipping avenues?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a loaded question too. I think where my hot buttons and triggers are, and I feel like you're doing this intentionally. That you're trying to see. You're trying to bait me into
trying to have a conversation here. Let's talk.
I'm kidding. No, I think I didn't know this headline that you just mentioned about the 2030 deadline from the UN. I wasn't aware of that, so this is new to me. But my knee-jerk reaction to that is that a couple things. One is that anytime the government gets ahead of technology and where it's at, that's terrifying to me, because they start making these arbitrary rules that may or may not be realistic, without necessarily having a clear plan or understanding of whether or not it's even possible or feasible, or how the supply chain can get to that point in 5 years, which really isn't that much time. And that's not much time at all to expect that the entire supply chain is going to be net neutral in its carbon emissions. The other thing I guess I think about is sort of an unintended consequences. I think, given the fact that you've already had supply chain disruptions, you've already had a pandemic, you've already had geopolitical issues with the war between Russia and Ukraine and other global geopolitical tensions, that there's already the pendulum sort of swinging back to more of a nationalist sort of let's just make our own stuff sort of mentality, which I don't think is good or bad necessarily. You might argue it's actually good if it benefits your home country. So I think what will end up happening when you add now this whole UN mandate to be net neutral by 2030, I think that's just going to further fuel this movement to where countries are going to be more self-sufficient, which, I think the pendulum could swing too far that other way, though, to where companies stop relying on international trading partners because they don't want to have to deal with these new rules and regulations. So that's sort of the mind's, sort of my knee-jerk reaction. The other part of it too comes from, going back to Elon Musk. You look at what he's done for electric vehicles, for example. There was no mandate that said he needed to create electric vehicles. He did it because it was a good business opportunity and he saw a way to make money. And he just so happens that he's having a positive impact on climate change. And I think that's, my personal opinion is that's what you should do, is let the market get to that point. Because I think we're going there anyway. Everyone's concerned about climate change. Even the ones that aren't that concerned or don't believe in it, I think a lot of them even are still wanting to, consume less and, just be more mindful of pollution and that sort of thing, because we all have to breathe the same air and everything. So I think there's no need for the government to now start setting these onerous rules and whatnot to further fuel what's already in place and what I think the free market is already going to fix as it is. So I tend to be more of a free market type of thinker, so that there is some bias in that response, but those are some of the immediate things that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify a few things. So this legislation by 2030 is in California in the United States here.
Okay.
So in those port cities. And so when we talk about the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, which is part of the UN, their goal, and it's the target is non-binding. And I think that's the argument here, is to achieve only 50% reduction in emissions by 2050. And that's their argument, is similar to yours of let's let the marketplace, the consumption kind of drive this while still working towards a more clean goal. So I think the challenge with that is there are local governments that are very, they might be tied to a political affiliation, whatever, right? That are driving the international shipping marketplace. And that, I think, to your point, is dangerous without just having all of the voices in the room that need to understand the implications, not just on a global or on a local level, but on a global level, right? In making those specific decisions.
Well, in the case of California, then, you look at that and you say, well, for those that aren't from the United States or aren't familiar with the United States politics, California is a very liberal state within the 50 United States. It's arguably the most liberal state politically. But then you look at other and there's a lot of ports, obviously, in California. But then you go to the East Coast and like Florida, for example, there's a lot of ports in Florida. And Florida is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a very conservative state for the most part, with lesser likelihood of the government saying that there's going to be these sort of climate change rules. So I could see happening in the case of the United States, where you have freedom of choice, shipping providers or supply chain managers might be more likely to look at other ports outside of California just to circumvent those rules. So, the government can try all they want. I don't know, they're not going to force something that isn't going to make economic sense. So in other words, if people look at those rules in California and say, oh yeah, that makes total sense, we can still be profitable, still follow those rules, it aligns with our social agenda or whatever, then they're going to keep shipping to California. But in other cases, they may say that doesn't align with what we think we can make money on or whatever. And they might, look to other ports outside of California. So I'm a skeptic when it comes to the regulations behind that.
Absolutely. Definitely an interesting conversation, though, of the global shipping market and the local impact. It doesn't matter really if it's geopolitical, if it is a natural disaster. Those types of things can really have an impact on the entire world, and a lot of rippling impacts on industries. So definitely an interesting conversation there. Now we can roll back in time and talk a little bit about Bluetooth technology. So Bluetooth technology is super interesting to me because, one, it's such a love-hate relationship, right? It's an amazing emerging technology that's been around for a long time, and but it also sometimes just does not work. It's it's a lot like cell phone service. the difference with Bluetooth is, and this is kind of when I get into public versus private cloud conversation with you when it comes to Bluetooth, is there's connectivity issues, there's range issues, which we've all experienced. The setup of device, the switching of devices can be clunky and not a great experience. They travel over unlicensed airways. So a lot of cybersecurity issues, a lot of top business people won't use Bluetooth when it comes to things like headphones for privacy concerns, those types of things. And then there's also lots of competition on those unlicensed airways where we're talking about things like baby monitors, other pieces of technology that utilize those. And then also, when it comes down to it, it's not the same as those private airways, which carriers here in the United States, like Verizon, or owns those bigger telecommunication companies. So I wondered, what this got me thinking of, Eric, is the cloud and the argument of a public versus private cloud when it comes to, one, just overall functionality, but two, security. Do you see any relation between the Bluetooth challenges and the use of a public cloud for your enterprise systems?
Sort of, but not really. I mean, what I mean by that is when you look at Bluetooth, sort of the unlicensed airwaves and some of the disruptions that in the cybersecurity concerns that come with that. It's different in cloud because you're not using sort of shared. I mean, you are using a shared infrastructure in some ways, but the applications themselves, I think a lot of it comes down to the applications themselves. And if you've secured the applications and other touch points with those applications, I think that's the bigger concern. But I don't think there might be more attempts to hack those environments, and there's more outside hackers that are trying to get into corporate networks versus trying to hack into my Bluetooth when I'm at the airport or whatever, listening to music. So I think it's a little bit different, but I think it's still a valid concern because you are sharing IT infrastructure, the physical IT infrastructure with other organizations. And that makes you a bigger bullseye, or that puts a bigger bullseye on you, I suppose. But so it's similar but different, I'd say, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that there will be a marketplace for this concept of a private cloud as enterprises migrate to more of SaaS-based systems?
Yes, I do. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of our clients move. They may not be fully committed to or comfortable with moving to the public cloud, but they can get comfortable with the idea of having a private cloud. And the other advantage of the private cloud is not only the potential cybersecurity superiority of that model, but also the fact that you have more flexibility to change the software. So in other words, if there's something you don't like about applications that you're using in the cloud, if you have a private cloud, you can do whatever you want with the software. But if you're in a public cloud, you're less likely, especially in a SaaS model where multi-tenant, where you've got multiple companies using the same software, you just have less flexibility in that model. So there's a lot of advantage, I think, to the private cloud for sure.
Excellent. Well, my last hot topic here is just sharing some findings. It's actually a Gartner recent survey when it comes to tech buying and tech-related purchases. So just to give you some background, it was done in November and December of 2021. There was over 1,000 respondents in North America, Western Europe, and Asian Pacific. And then it talks about their buying efforts for organizations around technology. And it specifically talks about the regret of a technology purchase, which I'm really interested to get your take on. And this regret happens at the peak for tech buyers that have not started their implementation. So they're holding a lot of this technical debt, if you call it, without actually using the system. And they were significantly frustrated by the buying experience. And specifically, what's interesting to me about this conversation, because we talk a lot about how frustrating buying new technology can be for organizations, but the issue that they really uncovered here in the research is the actual people that are involved in the buying process. Their experience with the new technology is prioritized over the concept of creating an enterprise user profile. And that persona, quote unquote, should be what you're meeting the needs for, not the specific people on the project or steering or software selection committee. So I wanted to get your feedback on how you help clients or through the third stage team create kind of this this persona of the business versus the actual people and their experience with the technology in the room or the decision makers for a software selection process.
Yeah, so it's a tricky balancing act because you want to understand from a variety of people throughout the organization how the current processes work and how, more importantly, how the processes could work in the future with better technologies. So it's a matter of sort of understanding, but not dwelling on why you do things the way you do today. Maybe if you're going to dwell on something you do today, you want to dwell on the things you do well and the things you want to preserve and maintain in a new system or new technologies. You don't want to dwell on, the old homegrown system that you've used for 30 years that has all these different keystrokes that you have to go through and different warts and issues you've got to navigate. That's not worth dwelling on too much, but you do just need to understand how the processes work and the workflows go. So I think that's a balancing act, is making sure you're finding the right balance between your current state and future state, as well as navigating the organizational structure of, the boots on the ground that are doing the work, understanding what it is they think they want in terms of what they do today, but also what they need to do in the future, but also having that executive sort of direction and alignment, which we'll come back to that executive alignment thread later in this show. Making sure you've got that alignment and vision and clarity of where you're headed as an organization, or where you want to be headed as an organization as a result of your digital strategy. So those are some of the things that come to mind when I think of that.
Yeah, I think this is a big moment for me. This might be one of the first times that I see the metaverse actually making its way into that enterprise software selection experience. Because you think about things like creating a persona or an avatar of, payroll, right? And it's not about Susie in payroll. It's about the experience of that person in payroll and being able to implement those data points and say, like, this is the best fit, leveraging a technology or a virtual reality opportunity, as opposed to just the human idiosyncrasies that comes from actually getting that feedback from an actual human being. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is. That's super interesting. And now you have me worried that, is the metaverse going to put, make consultants like you and I, is it going to make us obsolete? Is it all going to happen in the universe or in the metaverse?
Well, personally, I will never be obsolete. Definitely not. But no, I mean, we always know there's a human component to it. And I think that the investment on, speaking from, a self-preservation narrative here, is that there will always be an insight and an expertise to having someone come in and set this up for you. There's efficiencies for that. A technology will never be able to acknowledge, perfectly what it means for your business. It's like a dishwasher will never be able to walk into your house and install itself. A robot may do it, but someone had to program that robot and show, the consumer how to use it. So personally, I think there will be more need for that expert advice than less. But of course, you got to take that with a grain of salt because it's my job. So
yeah. Well, I think my goal after this episode, after we're done here, I'm gonna have to go get a pair of Oculus virtual reality glasses, get in the metaverse, and figure out how to just embed myself in the metaverse so people could find me there too. Maybe that's a way to just embrace it and go all in on that technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're getting some for you, I can really help on that front too, just to bring some new ideas to the table.
You do have 2 young kids that might enjoy that too, so that.
Or break them immediately. That would be what someone who can invent unbreakable sunglasses. You have, a market competitive advantage like no other when it comes to wearables. So.
Yeah, very true. Well, good. Well, that's good stuff. We're actually going to touch on the metaverse a bit when we talk to Lisa Pope here in a few minutes, or in just a couple seconds. We're going to bring Lisa onto the show. In fact, we're going to do that right after we take a quick break. We're going to have Lisa Pope from Epicor Software. She's the president of Epicor Software. She'll be on the show talking about enterprise technology and ERP software, the past, present, and future. And we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings. And the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Bad to the bone. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler Cheatham. We're both with Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. And being that we are technology agnostic, speaking of Third Stage Consulting and our next guest, we thought it would be good to have a software vendor on the show, but in a non-commercial sort of way, just to share thoughts on where the industry is headed. And the reason I'm so excited to have this guest on the show is because Lisa is someone that I've crossed paths with over the last couple decades in this industry. And she's worked at a number of different software vendors over the years. So she has a really good sort of global macro perspective of where ERP software and enterprise technology has been, where it's at now, and where it's headed in the future. And so even though she's the president of Epicor Software, she's coming at it more from an industry expert, more so than a software specific sort of expert, although she is that as well. So I'm excited to have Lisa on the show to talk about the past, present, and future of ERP software and enterprise technology. So Lisa, thanks for being here today.
Great. Thanks, Eric. I'm really happy to be part of the show.
Yeah, great to have you for your first time on the show. And you and I have known each other and crossed paths here the last couple of decades in this industry, because you and I have both been in it for a while. Maybe tell us a little bit, before we talk about your current role, maybe tell us a little bit about sort of your upbringing and how you grew up in this whole ERP software space.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually got into it right out of college and started working for a very small software company called Triad Systems, which was focused in the automotive and industrial sector. And I was actually on pre-sales. So I really learned the product, learned the industry, and then sort of evolved up through sales and obviously now president. But I have had the opportunity over the last almost 30 years to work for software companies ranging from 250 million to over 20 billion in a variety of different, industries, markets. And one of the, I think the best parts and the experience I'm most happy about and really pleased I was able to do is the global aspect. I've been to over 25 countries, as part of my business travel. I've sold in those countries, supported in those countries, and really had a chance to get a good awareness of the challenges and the differences that you face, obviously not just in all the states in the America, but also as you travel internationally. So it's been just a great career, and I really love what I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's what I think one thing you and I have in common is that we both started in this industry right out of college, and it's really all I know. I don't know about you, but this is all I know. So I'm glad you and I can commiserate or share our common experiences. And one of the things I really like about your background too, and the reason I thought you'd be so interesting to have on the show, among other reasons, is because you have that sort of you have that experience working with multiple different ERP systems. You've kind of grown up not just working with one specific type of solution, but a number of different ones. just to start, maybe how would you, if you had to sort of summarize how enterprise technology and ERP systems have evolved in all this time that you and I have been doing this, how would you sort of summarize that, the development and the evolution of ERP systems over the last couple decades?
Well, I mean, definitely for the better, right? When I started, believe it or not, software was actually tied to the hardware platform. So it was actually hardware companies that went out and traditionally sold software that only worked on their platform. So if you picked HP, you got HP software. If you went with NCR, you had their version of a distribution or a manufacturing product. So, thank God we moved past that. We got to open systems and then really focused in on things that we're desktop heavy, right? So we all went through that smart client era where everything was on the desktop, everything was loaded on the desktop, lots of IT, lots of administration, and difficult, I can definitely tell you from my experience working with global customers, they're especially trying to get everybody's version correct, all the challenges that happen with that. And so naturally now, I think the best thing about enterprise resource planning and really mission critical applications is the fact that these applications now you have a choice, right, to not just run them on premise with typically a much lighter client than we saw in the old days, or move the entire infrastructure to the cloud. And so I think, obviously that transition has really enabled business in a whole different way. So really exciting to see that. And like I said, I actually remember when we used to do demonstrations hauling the hardware along, with the system, right? So you literally had to bring everything to a customer to show them a demo,
Right.
and now we just do it all online, or a lot of it. So it's really great to see.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. It makes traveling a lot easier, I imagine,
Yeah.
not having to travel with all that stuff. Um, so what about, maybe tell us a little bit about Epicor, just to, before we sort of dive into some of these other questions I have for you. Tell us a little bit about Epicor for anyone on the line that maybe hasn't heard of Epicor or isn't very familiar with the company and the product.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's about $1 billion software company, and we're very specialized in terms of our focus. We really sell enterprise solutions into the make, move, and sell global economy. So if you're a manufacturer, if you're a distributor, if you're a retailer, basically selling those essential goods across that economy, that's really our target space. So we do have solutions that cross all three of those areas. So we may have a distributor who does some light manufacturing. They may also have retail counters. So that whole suite of products could sort of be used as we're seeing many of our customers sort of transition their businesses from being solely focused maybe on manufacturing or solely focused on distribution and starting to do a little bit of everything. But it's a global company. So we are basically all over the world. Our customers range from very, small, medium to business sizes, all the way to enterprise accounts, and really, again, very focused on sort of that global reach. So many of our customers have hundreds to thousands of stores or hundreds of locations that they're dealing with, how to really enable their solutions across that environment. And we are
Right.
headquartered out of Austin, Texas. I saw a few people in the chat from Texas. I'm based here in Dallas as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's great, and we have a lot of people joining here from all over the place. Chico, Texas. We have someone, Juice from Netherlands, someone from Malta, Manchester, England, India, Germany, Denver, Colorado, where I'm based, Miami, Spain, another India, Cairo, Egypt. A lot of different locations. So thank you everyone for letting us know where you're joining from today. So what about, let's start with, there's a lot of different things you and I can talk about. When we were prepping for this, I think we sort of, our minds went a million different directions, and I'll try to focus us, but curious to hear what the audience, what kind of stuff the audience wants to cover too. But just to start, one of the major themes that you and I talked about in preparation for this was cloud systems, and sort of, how cloud systems have evolved in recent years, what options customers have. Do they really need to be going to the cloud now? What if they don't want to go to the cloud? Maybe just help us to start, maybe help us unpack the whole cloud theme or premise. Where do you see, how have you seen cloud systems evolve, and how do you see cloud systems evolving now?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. When we first started positioning cloud, I think we saw, especially in some of these mission critical environments, that most companies wanted to start with sort of what I would call a point solution, right? They didn't want to move their ERP to the cloud. They tended to start maybe with this, Salesforce.com, right? Maybe a service-based app, their HR applications. And that was sort of a way for them to test the water. And we're still seeing many accounts, if they're making a cloud transition to start, that's typically what they'll do. Once they sort of get comfortable with that, they see the benefit of it, then there's usually a little bit more of an interest of saying, okay, let's now proliferate this and look for other cloud applications that sort of, support that portfolio. And then ultimately, I think typically there are a number of catalysts that we see that sort of maybe will have a customer say, okay, cloud now. But I think we have definitely seen a huge transformation, even in these key industries that are highly global, for customers to choose cloud, especially over the last 2 years. And we can certainly drill down more into that factors, with the pandemic and other things that I think have led to that. But I do think the trend is good. I think overall it does help enable a number of things that I know we'll talk about a little bit later in our conversation. But I also think, choice is still important. We do have many customers who, for whatever reason, it could be highly compliance, could be a very customized application that, really does take a lot of processing that they feel is better run on premise. But I think the good news for a lot of our clients today is that there is a choice. So the direction is certainly applications moving there, but customers are able to sort of, decide when the timing is right, or in many cases, business indicates maybe when it's time to consider to move.
Right. Yeah, makes good sense. And so it's in other words, it's not an all or nothing, necessary need to double down on cloud right now. You can sort of ease your way into it using point solutions or other migration or phasing strategies to get there.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen is typically there will be sort of an executive that comes in that feels really strongly. So, we'll see a CFO come in, put in a few point solution applications, and then say, hey, I see the benefits with this. We really should consider maybe moving more of our key systems. And then we'll often see a selection process start. I know you guys can get involved in those. And that's usually a catalyst with some kind of business change. We've also seen companies that are highly acquisitive want to have a platform to more easily integrate their acquisitions. And so for them, cloud is an area where they can easily sort of move someone onto the system and then sort of divest or roll them off that system. And then that company can obviously still leverage that same software with the vendor in a new environment. So there are some real benefits that we're seeing from a business perspective that, again, certain executives are sort of looking for cloud to solve some real business challenges. And I think that is what has probably driven it. The technology is great, and I can definitely talk about the advantages on the technology side, but even better when you have some real business reasons sort of driving that need for change.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, roughly what percentage of your customers would you say are either partially or fully on the cloud now versus the legacy on-prem? You're still trying to sort of convince them to move over. What do you have an idea?
I would say in terms of our existing install base, probably 70% are either on cloud or in a hybrid, where they're running some cloud applications and some on-premise. What's interesting, though, I think, is when you look at new systems, so customers that are making that selection process today, it's much higher. We're seeing more than 70% of new systems going to the cloud and not in a hybrid fashion. So making an all-in cloud decision to say, yes, I'm going to go full ERP and run that in the cloud. So definitely new. I think, people that are selecting and making that investment now are probably more likely to make a cloud decision. And again, there are certain industries that we see in certain specific cases. Some of the larger clients that already have, for example, quite a bit of infrastructure set up. They've got all the IT support. They've got the resources. A number of them may choose to still stay on premise, or if they are highly regulated and very concerned about some specific industry compliance capability, we may see a few of them staying on premise. But I think, the advances that you're seeing with security in the cloud and so many other things, other benefits for why companies want to consider cloud, I think that's really helping to drive those decisions.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. We're here with Lisa Pope from Epicor Software talking about the past, present, and future of ERP software and enterprise technology. We're going to continue the conversation, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. I'm here with Lisa Pope, president of Epicor Software. We're talking about the past, present, and future of enterprise technology. We've got a question from the audience here. This is from Juiced on LinkedIn. He's helping me with a nice transition into another topic, or sort of building on that topic. But apart from locations such as cloud, what are the major changes to ERP in the last 5 to 10 years that you've seen, both at Epicor and with other systems in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think some really good trends. First of all, a lot more ability to run applications mobilely, right? So it's not about sitting at your desktop, right? You're not always at your workstation. So the idea that you have more access to information, on your phone or on a tablet or on a device. So I think making applications more mobile is key. And it certainly helps us with new workers coming into the industry. That's an expectation for them, right? Everything sort of runs on their phone. I think the second thing is really about the user experience as well, right? The old ERP systems were horrible. I'll occasionally walk into a client that hasn't upgraded and you see some of those old screens. And, what happens is the users get very comfortable with that. They know exactly where to tab. They know exactly how to get to what screen. And in some ways that, to them is considered to be, productivity. But at the end of the day, once our clients move to that new version and they get to actually experience a whole brand new, very easy to use, and the ability for that user to really not have any kind of official training, just have it be intuitive, I think is really key. So I think probably for me, the mobile aspect and the fact that how the user interacts with the software is now being taken into consideration. Even in our development process, we use customer feedback on how things work to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make that experience really positive. And then I think the third thing would just be, the ability to really absorb on a more modular basis, right? The old ERP systems, you put in software for 40 industries, even though you were one, right? So I think a lot of, and certainly Epicor, our focus is it's very specialized. You're downloading software for your vertical, your specific industry. In many cases, there's sub-vertical capability. So you're not having to sort of deploy this entire system that's been written, which again makes it very hard to implement, very costly to implement, and certainly very difficult to upgrade. So really great to see, I think, those trends happening outside of just the cloud momentum.
Yeah, that last point's a really good one, because I think that's something that differentiates companies like Epicor, in that if you compare Epicor to like an SAP or Oracle, where they've built these big, massive, broad systems, and then they try to sort of back into force fitting it into certain industry situations, that's where a lot of companies get stuck, or they just find there's pretty severe limitations in that model. Whereas you guys have built the software for specific industries like manufacturing or retail, and in the case of different products you have. So I think that's something that I've noticed from Epicor going back, 10, 15 years. I know we've seen Epicor a lot in manufacturing and retail in particular. So that's a really interesting point.
I think it really matters on the services side. I mean, that to me, the concept of implementing software and then your provider sort of leaving, and then, okay, I'll come back 5 years later when you're ready to upgrade, right? That sort of cycle I think was very problematic. I lived through a lot of those cycles in many companies, and I think, again, just getting back to the cloud advantage, to me, that's probably one of the greatest advantages. Is now customers, they, that asset, in this case, it's off the balance sheet, but when you invest in software as a service, now you're getting all those new capabilities on a very regular basis. So you're maintaining the level of your investment. You're able to always take advantage of the best and the newest, and it's done in a more rapid pace, through a cloud deployment. And so the old days of sort of having to stop and rethink and implement, do that on these big cycles every 5 to 8 years, I think is really a thing of the past. And so for us, I think that's probably the best, is customers can absorb technology literally every time, those updates happen. And because they're done in small increments, it's not such a rapid change, a radical change for them, right? They're able to actually take advantage of it and then learn and then move on. So I think we're going to see just a lot better overall client satisfaction too with the deployment of these enterprise systems, because there is sort of a continual improvement versus this big bang upgrade.
Right, right. Now, I'm going to combine two questions into one here from the audience. I'll show you one and I'll read you the other, just because the other one's a fairly lengthy question, but they're sort of similar themes. But the first is from Kyler, who's my co-host on the Transformation Ground Control podcast. She says, what are some main considerations organizations should be aware of when migrating to a full cloud-based system? And I'll follow it up with another question that's sort of related, but completes the picture here of the question. But one of the biggest concerns I've been looking into is the fact of making sure the cloud vendor has all the proper configuration settings, etc., capabilities built into their system. Too many companies think that moving to the cloud will solve all of their problems. What they don't look into is if there's added overhead administration that's needed. Thoughts? So it's sort of building on this question here from Kyler. Really, how does cloud, maybe if I were to paraphrase, how does cloud change an organization? What do you have to be aware of in terms of changing to adapt to this cloud environment?
Yeah, I think that those are great questions. I think one area that is really important is a cloud system doesn't mean that there isn't still IT support on site, right? There's this perception that, the vendor takes care of everything, it's in the cloud, it's magic, right? And the truth is, you still have resources that are available to you that know the software, are able to still help and train. And I think that's one of the things we do when we go in and talk to customers about a 5-year, value proposition of moving to the cloud. I've seen them where people are like, you won't have any IT people, all those costs go away. And that's really not the case, right? You're not going to be in the same environment where the IT guy down the cube is able to come in and, maybe change something for you. But that support is still part, obviously, of a go forward plan. But I do think one of the big challenges a lot of our customers that are transitioning off, especially if they were in an environment with a highly customized system, is that they were used to that. So they were very used to being able to, make dramatic changes to the code and to the systems and the look and feel. The cloud systems today obviously are more configurable, so you don't need to customizing the way you used to. And certainly the settings that the person asked about is key. So making sure your cloud vendor does have sort of those industry templates and the ability for you to see that it's sort of pre-configured for you, and then you're able to, change switches in the setup and have it automatically sort of adjust. Those are all really important things. So that concept of configuration, not customization. But I think for us, that's the big change that we really talk through, is making sure the whole concept of cloud is that these should be best practices for your industry. And so what we don't want to do is take a cloud system and rewrite it to match your old legacy system, right? And so this perception of, how do you make it work the way we work, I think is probably the biggest thing that you go through as part of that, business transformation change. And then I think the third thing is just there is a transition period for users. It's like anything, especially for someone who's maybe been at that company for 15 years and is used to using that system. We usually find there is about, a 3 to 4 week period after you go live. We really make sure that that's an area where we sort of surround the client, because that's where the the big concern is just their ability to sort of absorb these new systems. But then we find very quickly their productivity is significantly faster. So, about a 2 to 3 week period where you've got some real challenges just getting through the that transformational change of how someone actually operates with the software, and then we see dramatic change. The other thing that I think is important with cloud is it does really provide some great benefits. I'm going to go back to the IT and the challenge today, but we've all seen all the concerns over security and compliance, and certainly one of the things the cloud does, just because of the infrastructure it's built on, we happen to run on Microsoft Azure, but clearly there are other providers as well, AWS, and the level of security and what they're able to provide. If you think about it, the world-class security that is in that infrastructure. Now a small company with 10 users gets to take advantage of that. They don't have to go hire someone to watch or monitor. They don't have to necessarily try to recruit all that staff. They're getting the advantage of literally best-in-class infrastructure, security, ability to scale. And so again, those economies really pay off, in the long term.
Right. Yeah, it's great. Great point. And I'm going to pull up another question here, or more of a comment that sort of dovetails with what you're saying here, Lisa. And that's, there's several initiatives a company has to take to be profitable: business transformation, digital transformation, workplace transformation. Business processes are the key. So I guess that sort of brings up another question that I think you were sort of touching on, which is how do you address business processes, and how do you ensure that your processes and workflows are actually leveraging the capabilities that you have in the cloud and these new technologies that are constantly evolving? What are some of the best practices you've seen there?
Yeah, and again, I think hopefully, the software providers that you look for, that's going to be an important part of their value proposition, right? Those industry templates and knowing that you are able to literally, see those industry capabilities that you may need for your specific sub-vertical as part of that sort of software configuration and process. So we really believe in that. That's a big part, not just of how we think about designing and developing the software from a business process flow, but also when you look to implement, right? Making sure that implementation is also done from, the value of, this is the business process we need to put in, and this is really what, how quickly we need to get there. So I think, again, that's a big piece and a big advantage of the cloud software these days is you should never have a consultant come in and say, well, how would you like it, right? The software sort of should be easily configured and already sort of pre-mapped for that important sort of vertical and process that you're looking for. So big difference in terms of implementation and what we used to see, many years ago.
Right. What about labor and workforce management? That's something that's the top of mind for a lot of organizations with the tight labor market. The challenge is finding the right skills and keeping those skills in-house and creating a better employee experience. There's a lot of stuff around labor and workforce management that organizations are struggling with. How are ERP systems in general, how are they helping address that concern or challenge?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's hard to hire and get the resources that you need right now. And so you really have to prioritize where you put your focus. So I think there's a couple things. One, I'll talk about cloud first, but then I'll just talk about ERP and how we view that. But certainly one of the advantages of going to cloud is that it does minimize some of the specialized skills that you may need that are hard to find in some locations, especially around technology. So whether that is, like I said, security, it's implementation expertise, it's finding somebody that knows that particular software that's going to, be there with you for the whole time. All those things sort of drive a cloud environment because it just means that you will not have to hire those specialized resources. Your software provider, your cloud provider provides those for you. And then a lot of that capability is built into software. You're not having to duplicate it at your site or location. So we definitely saw during the pandemic that huge shift of more clients saying, yeah, I'm going to go to the cloud now because we are having challenges even getting in the office, number one, and number two, getting those specialized resources. And then we talked a little bit about just the evolution of software and retaining people, but obviously people that are happy at work stay with the company. And so that is the whole experience. And if they're using an older, antiquated system. It's hard to get their job done. It's hard to get the information they need to do their job. That definitely leads to, workplace dissatisfaction and more people thinking about leaving. So having a newer system, having, that great user experience, and having those workers that have been there know that you're investing in them and continuing to make their jobs easier, I think is key. And then obviously for us, one of the big areas we're also really working at is, we have a lot of employees that, have been with the company 20 to 30 years, and that's an incredible luxury. Their expertise is phenomenal. They know their industry's cold. And we're really able to, provide that deep level of industry expertise. But on the flip side, it's also very important that we're constantly thinking about, recruiting. And when we go to look at recruiting, one of the things that we've really realized is, when we look at taking, college graduates and even when they're in college, putting them as part of our intern program, they want to be working on software that, helps enable their job. So they want to know that we're on the latest systems and that we've got a great environment for them to sort of build, their career. So it is really important to us, not just on the retention side, but also on the recruiting. I think having sort of that up-to-date modern environment for those workers does definitely help sort of get them not just to come to your company, but like in our case, we're very focused on taking those interns and then moving them into sort of, our business development team, eventually either into sales and marketing, or even into our IT or services organization. Again, it does come down to the environment, the culture of the company, but also the systems you use. So I think that's an important piece for us, is making sure that, we provide an environment that is going to encourage that new workforce to come in and want to stay. And then finally, I think, one of the big advantages of ERP systems, and it's not, before we might have done it for cost control reasons. And really what I just see now is it's not about cost. It's just not about being able to get the right resources. So obviously a lot of the applications that, we provide and that you would find in really these digital platforms do enable you to be more productive. So, whether you're automating your accounts payable components and you're able to do that now with less staff, if it's warehouse management capabilities and you're able to use less staff in the warehouse, again, less about cost cutting, just more about the fact it's really hard to hire, then obviously these systems can drive dramatic improvement and really help you balance that shortage of labor and not have it affect, your top line.
Yeah. Yeah. You had a couple really good points in there. I mean, the starting maybe working backwards here from some of the comments you made, the whole definition of scale for a growing organization is to be able to grow the company without necessarily having to hire one for one to your labor force. So that, those efficiency gains, they may not reduce in sort of eliminating jobs per se, but as you're growing, you can do more with the same amount of people. And I think that's where we see a lot of our clients going, or the way to think about that.
Yeah.
The other thing too that you bring up, that it's sort of tying back to a point you made earlier when you're talking about people that are comfortable with their old system, and you mentioned just now in your response about people that are comfortable with their industry, they know their industry really well. You sort of have this dichotomy in the space today where you have people that are maybe highly tenured, they're perfectly comfortable with that old green screen system where you enter the transaction code and you've got all the codes memorized. But then you think about someone coming out of college, they grew up with Instagram and TikTok and all that stuff. And that's like a culture shock for someone to come into an organization like that and try and figure out transaction codes and work off this green screen that I would imagine looks pretty foreign to someone who hadn't seen it before. Still looks foreign to me, even though I remember seeing them more commonly in the 90s. It still looks foreign now. So I think that dichotomy and that balance, of sort of leveraging that tribal knowledge, leveraging that skill set that you already have in-house, but also recognizing that you've got to create a better employee experience, especially for younger employees. I think that's a big benefit of modern ERP systems as well.
Absolutely. We actually, one of our interns that we had on the marketing side, they actually did a presentation back to the executive team on Epicor's brand perception and what they would do differently or what they could see, when they went out and looked. And so we got such great recommendations from that exercise, things that we would not have even thought of in terms of, where to place some of our training materials, or, they're like, you guys really don't have a presence on YouTube. Why not? Right? Like, I mean, we were on the traditional social, channels, but maybe not leveraging something like that as much as we could have. So I think, again, I think I'm really, the workforce management issue is really near and dear to my heart, because I recognize the value of having this, incredible, great industry knowledge. But I think, like many companies, you've got a significant number of people that potentially are going to be retiring in 10 to 15 years, and really looking at how you're going to develop and rebuild all that great tribal knowledge, I think is really important. So it's a very active priority for us, and something that we put a lot of thought into it. And, like I said, those, that newer workforce wants to have mobile apps. They want it to be very intuitive. They want to be able to work from home and work in the office and have a system that supports them doing both. And again, that's part of, the beauty in a lot of cases of cloud, because it does just enable that worker to be a little bit more remote, a little bit more flexible in where they are working from.
Right. Actually, that's a perfect segue into a question we have from Artium. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, on YouTube. Artium says, what are your thoughts on office work versus work from home versus a mix of both strategies? I've covered this in the podcast before, and I've been roasted for my opinions on this. So I'm gonna put you on the seat, deflect some of that.
It's boy, I'll tell you, that really, I think, hit home for us. We, in our company, we sell to really these essential businesses, right? So during the pandemic, they were all open. So, if you think about an Ace Hardware store, anything that's basically sold in that store is probably distributed and manufactured by an Epicor client in some capacity. And they were open, and not just open, but had world, record volume, crazy, because one of the few places that you could actually go to, I think it became a date night, was to go out to the hardware store. So I think when we looked at that as a company, we could not really not be out there with them, right? You think about the implementations we were involved in, they did not stop. The stores were still open, the volume was increasing, and we still had a number of customers that decided to make their decisions to continue on their projects because they felt things maybe were a little slower. And so they said, hey, let's go ahead and use this time to do the cloud upgrade, or move to the next version. So as a result of that, we found ourselves still very actively going out to see clients, still traveling. We had to, definitely do some things with shifting territories in some cases, so people could drive to a customer versus flying, and really made those changes as our customers dictated. So we sort of took a customer approach of how virtual we should or shouldn't be versus maybe a corporate perspective. And I think that really paid off. We certainly know a number of the opportunities that we were selected in over our competition was because our team did show up, did walk the floor, did look at their manufacturing, did sit there and really understand the company in person, and not try to do everything over video. So despite the fact that we saw great productivity gains by not everyone traveling to every meeting, I think we feel strongly that interaction in our industry with our customers is very, very critical and very important. And if they were open every day, us showing up and being there with them meant a lot and really strengthened that customer bond. So I think it really does depend on who are your clients, what market are you serving. I don't think there's one right answer. And I know for me personally, I had great pride, like many of us who've grown up in sales, of being a road warrior, right? You run yourself by how many millions of miles you have on your airline and what level you're at. And so there was this sort of perception of traveling everywhere means I'm busy and unproductive. And so I know for me and many of my leadership team, we did recognize the value of having uninterrupted time to actually get real work done versus always sort of juggling and multitasking. So I do travel quite a bit now, but I'm very focused on the days that I am in my home office with, what I would call sort of those key work streams that need to happen, or if there is a customer video or something like that I need to be on. And then I, travel to go see customers. So if I'm going to be traveling now, I don't want to travel for an internal meeting. I'd much rather travel to be part of that. So I think you're going to continue to see a mix. I will say that workers, though, getting back to how you recruit and retain people, there is an expectation now that they don't want to come into the office every day. And so I think for us, we've been more flexible in our policy in terms of, the ability to work from home and the ability to work in the office, with an understanding that, we're not going to really have any positions that would be 100% remote. We still want to encourage people to come into the office for either a team meeting or, again, an important client meeting. So based on the role, based on the clients that you're selling to, and I think the industries, that you're involved in, I think we'll continue to see a range of people, and feelings. And certainly we've seen some companies go all the way back, and say, everybody either show up in the office or you're fired. And then we've seen clients that have literally said, we're not going to have a corporate office anymore, right? We're going 100% virtual. So I know for us, that touch is really important. And so we are going to stay very connected and allow some flexibility, but knowing that it is important to be back in the office with your colleagues and definitely being able to service your clients.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And as it relates to ERP software in general and its ability to support all three models, really, either the fully in-person, the fully remote, and or the hybrid, that gets back to some of the trends you talked about with cloud, mobile interaction, the overall employee customer experience, all that stuff are, those are all considerations as it relates to ERP systems in particular. What about, so if we kind of move beyond ERP systems, so in other words, you look at core ERP system that's meant to integrate an entire organization. You mentioned before how one of Epicor's differences is that it focuses on and builds software specific for specific industries versus trying to be everything to everyone. But still, even in that model, there's going to be limitations, right? There's only so much capability you can provide in one single system. So what do you see in terms of options that organizations have? So, anything beyond ERP that they might need to complete their digital transformation roadmap?
Yeah, I think there's a number of systems that have sort of evolved recently that have become, really key. And in some cases they are, they're still sold through, the ERP provider, but they can also sort of run in that standalone mode, right? Where a company may say, I'll keep my existing ERP, maybe, not do the upgrade at this point and move it to the cloud or go on a new selection, but I'm going to go ahead and enhance it with, with a different product and maybe get that, faster return from a business benefit. I think one of the areas that we've seen probably the most interest in recently is what we call CPQ, which is that configure, price, and quoting. And again, probably because of the industries we serve. But I think one of the things that, that customers like now is, the Amazon experience where they can get on, look at something, visualize it in their house. In many cases, if you're buying a rug, let me see what it looks like in my room. There's, a little picture where you're able to do that. And then being able to, make that purchase and feel like the whole thing is done. And so even if you're a manufacturer, I'll take a boat manufacturer, that ability for a customer to log onto a system, look at a series of boats that they may be interested in, configure the boat that they would actually like with all the options and the color, be able to look at it and see the size, get the pricing for that, order it, but maybe even taking it a step further and then visualizing that boat in their existing dock, right? Big mistake that many people make. They buy a boat that's too big for the dock that they may have, or won't work, in terms of the angle of pulling the boat in. And so, one of the things we've seen with, CPQ especially is that next level of, again, for manufacturing, not just doing a simple configuration and a price and a quote, but actually being able to visualize it in the context of other parameters. So that's probably for us one of the fastest selling sort of what I would call point solutions or strategic solutions that can be used sort of independent of your ERP base. And so again, very fast sort of time to value. And again, because it's sort of a customer facing app in this case, the direct manufacturer has the ability to actually link to a consumer directly, and even if that order ultimately gets credited through a dealer, the ability for the manufacturer to retain that sort of relationship and also see that the customer is interested in this. They start to get information on that prospective client, et cetera. So that's one example. There's certainly a number of other ones. We see a lot of interest in service-specific modules right now as well. But I think those are other great examples of where a company can go ahead and sort of make a decision to change a business process that's very critical, and again, in this case, very customer-focused, without necessarily making a huge switch to their entire ERP system.
Right. Yeah. So there's, I think what you're saying there is it's not a all or nothing proposition. I think a lot of times organizations think either I'm going to go with a single ERP system or I'm going to go with the best of breed approach where I've got, 15 different systems. But what you're saying is you could sort of do more of a hybrid where you've got a core ERP system that does 80% of what you need it to do. And then maybe you have, for the other 20%, you've got these bolt-ons for CPQ or, CRM, HR tech, whatever the missing link might be.
Yeah, and I think, in a perfect world, you're going to have, your core ERP system, especially if it's in the cloud, then that integration is a lot easier because there's a lot more standard interfaces that are being used. So I think the big thing, again, it gets to is, maybe you've got a really solid relationship with your ERP system, but there may be another piece of functionality that you're interested in. And the ability for you to be able to still go ahead and purchase that and have it easily integrate, I think is another big advantage and something that, is part of sort of, I know we're going to talk more about Industry 4.0, but this ability to quickly integrate and have sort of a seamless enterprise, not just within your four walls, but outside as well, I think is key. And it does, like I said, extend your ERP in many cases because it gives you the ability to add those products on if for any reason you're not in a mode in the immediate future where, you're going to make that decision to switch.
Yeah. We're here with Lisa Pope from Epicor Software talking about the past, present, and future of ERP software and enterprise technology. We're going to continue the conversation, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. I'm here with Lisa Pope, president of Epicor Software. We're talking about the past, present, and future of enterprise technology. You mentioned Industry 4.0. I'm going to bring up a question from the audience here from Kyler, who says, can you talk about, I'm going to maybe broaden this question a little bit, and we could probably spend an hour just on this one question, but we'll try to summarize it here. But can you talk about some emerging tech in relationship with Epicor? So in other words, with where you see Epicor and other ERP vendors going in general, do you see them leveraging artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, metaverse, virtual reality, augmented reality? This will sort of lead us into Industry 4.0 as well. What are some of the, emerging tech, outside of cloud? I know we keep coming back to this theme of what else, what else is happening in the future? Where else are we headed?
Yeah. Well, I think Industry 4.0, obviously is important to the industry in terms of really being that next generation in terms of that fourth industrial revolution. And there are a number of key pieces of technology that I think are key to that sort of will help many manufacturers really sort of, uplift their environment and get some, huge digital transformation and business benefit. We spent a lot of time talking about cloud computing, and that's clearly one of the foundations of Industry 4.0. And I think because it enables the other technologies to facilitate and work easier. So that is one of our recommendations is sort of if you're on this path for digital transformation, step one is move to the cloud. So that's, that's sort of if you do that, then the rest of it becomes a lot easier. But there are certainly other big pieces of this that are key. One is certainly big data. That's a big element of Industry 4.0 and the ability to really, we've been collecting transactional data in all these systems, the ability to really leverage that data and make decisions and use it for analytical purposes, predictive analytics, being able to know when a machine is going to fail before it fails, is one example. And I think for us, certainly even at Epicor, that's really our next evolution is when we look beyond our ERP systems, we have a number of applications now that focus in on providing data insights, data analytics, and really helping our customers get more information prior to, to them thinking about it, right? So that predictive component. The other big area that we're seeing that we think is really key is just the whole proliferation of IoT and the Internet of Things. And again, if you think about how that can be leveraged in manufacturing, we've had customers that are supplying, medical things that have to be, stored at a certain temperature, having devices that can actually track the temperatures in that warehouse or in that bin or along the entire supply chain, knowing if for any reason that temperature has dropped beyond the point that it should have, that that whole batch, for example, in this case, is no longer good. So there are a lot of very, very specific uses that can be used, and I think benefit for many companies. So those are probably the two that I see being deployed the most right now and leveraged the most is really Internet of Things, IoT, and the big data. We're definitely seeing more focus around some of the virtual reality and the artificial intelligence. Even in our software product now, we have sort of an AI capability that allows you to ask questions and get answers, etc. But I think those are like evolutions that we're going to continue to see more and more companies start to deploy. But I do think what Industry 4.0 has at least given everyone is a very good roadmap to make those digital transformation changes and really allow a company to move to that next level and do it in a fairly predictable fashion, because there are specific use cases for each of these sort of industry trends that are happening that that they can sort of learn from. And that's again a big area that we try to do with our clients is make sure that we're working with them on those projects, leveraging those use cases, and then sharing them so that other manufacturers can see, how these things are being deployed in a real world environment, not just from the perspective of, the internet and it telling you what to do.
Right. Yeah. Yesterday I recorded a batch of YouTube videos for my YouTube channel. One of the things I covered, one of the topics or one of the videos was metaverse. And so I went down a rabbit hole the last couple of weeks, just sort of researching the metaverse or where it's come, how it's evolved, where it's headed. So I guess, what you mentioned the boat example earlier, the boat that doesn't fit in the dock. And I can't help but wonder, someday, could I design a boat in the metaverse, go test out the boat in the metaverse, see if it fits in my dock in the metaverse, take it out for a ride, see how it looks and feels, and then order a product, which would then integrate into my ERP system directly. Do you see that ever happening, or am I too much of a child of the 80s that's dreaming of impossible?
I think it could be. I really, I was surprised how quickly we made an acquisition of a product called KB Max, which is now our CPQ product. And one of the big advantages it did have beyond just, all the real cool customization piece and seeing the boat was the ability to pick it up and move it and actually see it in your environment. And whether it was a boat or, it's windows for your house, it's a shed you're building in the backyard, whatever it is, for you to be able to visualize how something looks, I think is key. So, the next step to actually allow you to be able to potentially drive it, I'm sure will be right around the corner. But there's so many, I think, business applications and uses now that are starting to emerge that really are making a difference. And I think we've seen a really convergence of industries. We haven't talked a lot about that, but the manufacturer that used to just make things, I think the whole environment has really shifted where everybody's more consumer focused, right? So because of that, they want to know who their customers are. They want to have some interaction with them. And so the ability for our customers to sort of, not view ERP as the back office system, but really realize that this is an extension of how you interact, not just with your customers, but all your suppliers. And it is really a supply chain based, productivity tool, I think is kind of where we're headed.
Yeah, that's good stuff. That makes sense. So I guess just to wrap up the conversation and bring it all full circle, what advice would you give to an organization that's about to embark on an ERP initiative or just some sort of systems modernization initiative? What sort of starting advice would you give them? How do they get started on the journey? How do they take all the stuff we've talked about? How do they take that all into consideration and make it meaningful for their digital strategy and roadmap?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think first it does start with sort of an executive sponsor in that account, right? I've seen a lot of projects start and potentially stop based on whether or not there is executive support. So I think making sure that the project is, has got great business value. And I know there are a number of opportunities. Epicor provides a capability to come in and sort of help assess. I know there are many software consulting firms as well that will do that. But I think making sure that there's a solid business value plan around it, and it's not just a technology project, is key, because then, first of all, we've just seen those projects go way smoother. We've also seen that, you tend to get just the results are significantly better because the focus and the priorities are there. And I think that's the next piece of this, is really making sure that you've got the people and process internally that can assist you. Because I think one of the things that we see is, it can't be someone's night job, right? When you start on a project like this, you really do need to have a dedicated team that's going to sort of help shepherd the project through the organization and really help drive those results. And then I do think it does make sense in a lot of cases to, have some outside assistance in terms of either helping you through that process, and making sure that you're considering your options and that you're really weighing the pros and cons, especially if you are in a situation where you're not happy with the existing solution. I think it's worth the time and energy to take a step back and say, okay, where do we want to go from here? What does it make sense for us to do? And then I think just the plan is really key. I think the good news is the old ERP implementations of 18 to 24 months that then end up becoming 3 years are really, they're out of the norm for now. We're seeing clients want to do much more of a rapid implementation style where they work on getting the core business processes moved, and then, over time may add additional capability. But I think really making sure that you have a plan for so that you don't get that sort of ERP fatigue, right, over a long period of time. So I think people are key, executive sponsor, definitely the process, and then just, as I said, making sure that you look at this as a rapid plan to that business benefit, so it doesn't just become a very laborious, long, technology project.
Right. It's just a money pit that doesn't deliver any value. I think those days are
long gone.
Rearview mirror. Yeah, companies just don't have that sort of risk tolerance anymore, and they're getting a lot smarter about how they deploy technology. Well, good. Well, how do you, if I'm interested in Epicor, I don't know much about it, but I want to learn more. What's the best way for me to learn more about Epicor?
Definitely our website, epicor.com. You can see the key verticals that we specialize in. We have chat capabilities. So if you're interested, there's someone available to you immediately for any questions that you may have. But yeah, we welcome the opportunity certainly to talk to anyone in our key industries and see if there's anything we can do to help. And I've really enjoyed being able to just reach out and talk to so many of your listeners. I'm really passionate about what we do, and I really do believe that, the transformation we've seen in the last few years it's in my career, it's probably the most significant in terms of, the business value that these systems are providing. So it's a great time, certainly, to be in our space.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. That was a great conversation. Really appreciate having you on the show. Loved having you as a first-time guest here. A lot of good stuff we covered there. In fact, there's a few trends that we want to unpack and touch on in some more detail. So we'll get to that here in just a moment. But in the meantime, we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. And Kyler, we just had Lisa Pope on the show from Epicor Software. She talked about some of the macro trends and sort of the history of the enterprise tech space and where it's headed, all that good stuff. What were some of your takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, what a great conversation. It's great to see two people that really kind of grew up in the industry talk about how it's evolved. And it's also very refreshing to hear a software vendor say things like, a hybrid cloud is an option, or kind of easing into the cloud migration or an upgrade, if you will, is something that can be a strategic business decision, which I think a lot of times isn't always so authentic in that sales conversation. But I think it was great to hear that from her, certainly, and hearing that. So I want to ask you a few questions. You know me, I always like to write down some questions to follow up. But when we are talking about kind of that upgrade cycle that you guys had mentioned, when it comes to moving from an on-prem solution to a cloud solution or those types of things, it sounds like the integration of really the vendor partnership in that used to be kind of you sell the software, then kind of back off and then come back to it when they're ready to upgrade or the organization is ready to upgrade. But it sounds like the cloud really has created a more long-term partnership structure. Is that correct or accurate?
It is. And what we're seeing is that because you're paying for ongoing subscriptions, you're obviously creating a more sticky situation or a sticky environment between software vendor and customer, because now you're all your data and your workflows and your software is in the cloud with a specific vendor. So you're paying money that for usage of the software and continuous upgrades of the software. So it does, in my opinion, create sort of a stickiness and a higher switching cost for people that might eventually want to switch out of that ERP system, that cloud system. It's going to be harder in the future, I think, to make that change potentially, especially if the software doesn't evolve the way you need it to, or if your business evolves in a way that diverges with what the software can do. There is going to be time where organizations need to move away from that software vendor, and that migration is going to become more difficult. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think, yes, it creates a longer-term partnership, but it could create a unhealthy partnership that's hard to get out of if you find that those switching costs become too high in the future.
Absolutely. And that's a good segue into that next topic of that internal IT need and kind of myth busting the idea that moving to a cloud solution kind of eliminates the IT skill sets or competencies that you really need to maintain and support these systems, which I think is important to consider. And something that a lot of times a cloud perception can misalign the need for that support structure and infrastructure within an organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of reminds me of you talking to Ridwan about the evolving roles of that CIO and making sure that CIO continues to understand the need for the infrastructure. It might look different, but still needing that in-house support when it comes to switching or migrating to the cloud.
Yeah, that is very similar. There's a lot of commonality there for sure.
I thought it was really interesting too how she kind of I wrote down how to make it work how we work type of thing, right. Because we go in and assess needs of an organization, right, and then we try and find the best solution for whatever their goals and objectives and needs are. And I think it's an interesting perspective that you still have to consider the software functions a couple ways. And then there will be some compromise when it comes to what exactly the needs are of the business and an off-the-shelf software. So it's kind of interesting to hear that from the vendor perspective, as opposed to us, where we really focus on the business needs. Not at all that Lisa and team don't. But for us, that's the number one priority. And of course, for them, the functioning of their software and the success of their customers, of course, is a priority. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of like you've got to marry the two schools of thought. You've got the school of thought that I think Lisa was sort of advocating, which is software has pre-built, pre-configurations, industry best practices, all that good stuff. That can inform and educate on how you could be doing business, but it may not align, and it's not going to align 100% with what it is you need. So that leads to the other school of thought, which is you let the processes drive what the technology does. And you're going to have different answers for different parts of your business or different business processes. So the more critical business processes might be driven more from the business first and the way you operate first. But other more commodity or vanilla based processes within your organization that aren't really a source of competitive advantage, those would be examples or good candidates for processes that you let the software sort of dictate how you do business. And so, one thing I don't do in interviews is I try not to argue with the guests. I'm not here to tell them they're right or wrong. And in fact, people have roasted me for this in the past, especially with, interestingly enough, Walker Reynolds, when he was on a few weeks ago, and we talked about Industry 4.0. He had I do remember a couple of things that he said that I didn't quite totally agree with. But I got roasted for why didn't you argue with him? Why didn't you correct him? And I'm like, I'm not here to correct anyone. But that is one that, whereas, Lisa and I might see the world a little bit differently, which actually doesn't surprise me because most software vendors think that way. They think our software has best practices and we're bringing these competencies to the table. And there's some truth to that, but that's only part of the truth. The other part of the truth is, how do you take your business processes and let those drive certain parts of your transformation?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you didn't argue with Lisa because, she seems like she could really go toe to toe with you. So I would be, scared for you. No.
Yeah, she might out debate me for sure.
Yeah, right. No.
She's very poised and very logical. And,
yeah. She's very impressive. And of course, I think the point that everyone makes there is the different perspectives when it comes to business advisory, which you in third stage brings to the table, and then also the vendor, because that's what they need to do is say this is how our software works, right? Because the last thing they need to do is say it works this way, and then that's not what actually happens, and that's where we get into our roles as expert witnesses, right? And saying what should have gone. And nobody wants that. The organization doesn't want that. We might want that because it's a great line of revenue for us. But
right.
But it's a great kind of message that there's perspectives for everyone at the table, and the more you evaluate, hear, and are mindful of all of the different messages and understand those narratives of everyone that's trying to help with this very big process. So definitely interesting. I also liked that she mentioned kind of that 3 to 4 week period that they stay in touch. It almost reminded me of a surgery or recovery period, where you are kind of managing to that new change within your organization. And I was wondering what typically is third stage's role in that post implementation period when it comes to helping the vendor support the system and then helping the organization kind of figure out the system. I know we focus a lot on user adoption and those types of things, but I thought I might ask you to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, it depends on how the initial implementation went. Oftentimes we have clients that hire us after an implementation and say, hey, we just implemented technology X, whatever it is, and it didn't go well. It was a total failure. We need your help. In those cases, you're coming in more to stabilize and remediate a problem and helping, sort of get the project or the implementation out of a ditch. That's not at all ideal, but it's something, I hate to say it, but we're good at it just because we have so many people that make that mistake and then hire us to come clean it up. The ideal scenario, though, is that you do the implementation well, not perfectly, but you do it well. and you have a fairly successful, not a perfect, but fairly successful or a relatively successful go live. And now your focus isn't so much on fixing a problem and digging the project out of a ditch, but rather you're focused on maximizing the business value that you get out of the project. If you think about all the money and time that's spent on these transformations, some companies spent years and millions of dollars on their implementation only to just let it fizzle away or just to totally underwhelm in terms of business value at the time you go live. That incremental effort and cost to maximize business value after go live has a huge ROI. So it's like you're taking the one thing that arguably delivers the most ROI of anything you could possibly do in a digital transformation, and a lot of companies just ignore it because they just want to be done with it. They're just like, let's just go live and let's move on with our lives. So to answer your question, though, what we do in those cases where it's not digging out of the ditch, it's not project remediation, it's more help us get more value out of it. Here's where you start to identify and prioritize where the obstacles to business value are. And typically it's pretty low hanging fruit. There's usually a ton of low hanging fruit of stuff you can do to really optimize and maximize the value you get from your investment that you just made. And so things like end user refresher training or rethinking or tweaking certain business processes that maybe aren't working as well as you thought they would. You go in and you fix just that part of the transformation. You're not redoing the whole thing. You're just fixing certain things that are more focused. Those are a couple examples. A lot of times there's certain modules that weren't deployed right, or you didn't configure it right, or perhaps you need to add some customization or a third-party bolt-on to really get the most value out of it. So you really have to look at all the problem areas, which usually there's a sort of a laundry list of things that you could have done better or that you could be doing better post-implementation. Then you prioritize those based on the level of effort versus the payoff you get from it. And then you say, let's go tackle these 10 or 20 things or whatever it is, and let's get the most value out of it. So that whole process is what we help clients through post-implementation. But again, it just depends on if they're sort of in that, let's get more value out of it, or are we trying to let's just survive? We can't ship product because it was such a disaster. Come in and help us. Those are two totally different scenarios, but we're used to seeing both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really interesting, that maximization of value. I think it also goes with a lot of what Lisa was talking about their kind of customer approach when it came to all your questions about their or the audience questions too about servicing customers in specifically a manufacturing environment, right? Because you can't do a ton of that remotely. And if you need to actually go in and evaluate that after the pandemic hit, what that looks like, because I think a customer by customer approach is so important. And I'm glad that, they have the autonomy to do that, because a lot of times bigger companies don't. There is a standardization to that as opposed to the case by case approach.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about her mention of recruiting and kind of the workforce management side, because I thought her perspective was really interesting in the fact of building up a culture from the younger workforce. And you do a lot of lectures for higher education and academia. I wonder what your take is on bigger software companies bringing on younger members and almost this standardization of needing to operate in a more technical driven user environment for software vendors specifically. They're not always known for having the most intuitive user environment because they are so large. So what's your feedback on that?
Well, I think that's where you're seeing the advantage of best of breed point solutions. She talked a little bit about that too. I think she was talking about the CPQ example, the configure price quote is sort of a solution that is very targeted to one workflow, one part of a business, and it just does that one thing really well. And so that can create a better user experience on one hand. On the other hand, it sort of complicates things because now you've got multiple systems you might have to interact with. But if the technology and the tools work better, it might be better to have more tools that are more aligned with what you need versus just having one tool that, all you've got is a hammer and you're trying to build a house with a hammer. Be nice to have some other tools if you're building a house. So you have to find that right balance for what it is you're trying to accomplish there. But I think in general, though, even the big, massive, bloated ERP systems of the past are still, or of the more recent past, are still better than some of those really old ERP systems that are on the old green screens and mainframes and all that stuff. That to me is just total culture shock to, a millennial or whatever the generation. What's the generation younger than you millennials?
Gen Z.
Gen Z. Yeah, Gen Z. I can't even imagine them even understand. It'd be like learning a foreign language to learn how to operate an AS400 based system or whatever. So yeah, I think that's an important consideration for sure. And it was interesting too, because she, when we were prepping for the interview prior to the podcast, that was one of the things she really wanted to talk about. Like she had a couple things that's like, hey, can we talk about this? And that was one of them she wanted to make sure we touched on.
That's excellent. Yeah, I feel like the younger workforce for me is just, it's such a mystery at this point. It's kind of, how do you do it? How do you do it in an in-person environment? How do you do it in a hybrid work environment? How do you do it in a technology cultural environment while still honoring that tribal knowledge that a lot of your maybe older employees may have? It's a really interesting time to be a business leader when it comes to the technical space.
Right.
Well, that was such a great conversation. I think the metaverse was the one thing that I think is definitely interesting to hear, and hearing that, your video's coming out on it too, which I'm glad you finally embraced that after me talking about it, for weeks and weeks and weeks. But it's a very interesting concept when it comes to what a software vendor thinks that will look like. And then lastly, the convergence of industries, I think, was really interesting when it comes to the metaverse and understanding specifically from a manufacturing standpoint. You might have just been able to manufacture this one thing in a physical realm, if you will. But in the metaverse, you might be able to have an entirely new product line, which is a very interesting idea, and is going to call for a lot of flexibility. And I think the one thing that she had given that piece of advice at the end was that executive support and alignment, which is what your keynote was on from our APAC focused digital stratosphere. So it's such a good segue into the rest of the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we're going to play this clip of a presentation I gave at that event at the digital stratosphere for Asia Pacific just earlier this year, a few weeks ago. And we're going to play that clip, and it's a really good discussion about why executive alignment is so important, how to detect whether or not your executive team is actually aligned and rowing in the same direction, and how to take their vision. When I say they, I mean the executives. Take the executive vision for the organization as a whole, and how to translate that into a digital strategy and a digital transformation plan that aligns with that strategy. So that's what we'll talk about here. I'm going to play that clip here, but first we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler Cheatham. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as all the audio podcast platforms. So be sure to check us out there, subscribe, like us, and give us a comment if you wouldn't mind, too, a review on the podcast platforms you're listening on. Our next segment here is on executive alignment. This is actually a clip from our Digital Stratosphere online event for the Asia Pacific market that we hosted just a few weeks ago. And this is a presentation I gave as a keynote in that session. about how to get executive alignment and how to know if you have it or if you need work on executive alignment, and how to translate that executive alignment into a digital strategy that's aligned with your overall goals and objectives. So let's play you the clip, and then we'll come back and unpack some of the concepts here. But let's roll the clip of my keynote on executive alignment. And so one of the things that we look at when we're chatting with clients and working with clients is ensuring that we have clarity on what the roadmap is and how we're going to help clients reach their third stages of success. And much like a rocket launch, which is where the analogy for third stage came from, there are 3 stages to a rocket launch, and that's really much of how we view digital transformations. And so when you look at a rocket launch that has 3 stages, the first 2 stages are what get it up into space, and then the third stage, final launch, is sort of the boost that gets it up into its final height and speed in orbit. That's a lot like digital transformation, because transformations are constantly fighting gravity and inertia and trying to gather momentum and trying to change the status quo. And there's a lot of risk. It's fraught with risk, and most organizations fail to reach that third stage of success. And so really what our goal is and what our job is when we're working with clients and when we're having conversations like what we're having today with organizations throughout the world, is we're trying to figure out how do we help this particular client reach that third stage of success. What is it that is going to align best with their strategy and their overall organizational needs? And that's really the challenge and the focus of helping clients reach that third stage of success. And so we as a company not only are named after that rocket launch analogy, but there's a few other things that are important about who we are as an organization and as a team. And certainly the 3 of us or the 4 of us that you hear speak today with you during this workshop are going to find that we're all 100% technology agnostic. So we're not affiliated with any software vendors. We don't sell software. We don't specialize in one type of technology or system or one vendor. Instead, we focus on ensuring that we help clients select and implement whatever sort of technology from whatever vendors might make the most sense for an organization. And the other thing about the company that makes us unique is that we do view these projects as business transformations more so than technical initiatives. The technology is certainly very important, but the even more important components of transformation are going to be things like the change management, the people side of the equation, the process management, process reengineering, as well as the overall program management and business goals and objectives. So those are some of the challenges that are some of the aspects of the company that are important to note. And in terms of understanding, before we get into executive alignment, one of the first things we need to understand is what exactly is digital transformation. And transformation means a lot of different things. There's a lot of different buzzwords out there in the marketplace, different types of technologies that can be deployed as part of a transformation. And so ensuring that we have that sort of focus on what type of technology it is we're trying to deploy is very important. So, for example, a lot of times organizations think that digital transformation must just mean ERP implementation. Some might think it's Internet of Things. Some might think it's CRM or human capital management or artificial intelligence, machine learning, Industry 4.0, manufacturing execution systems. There's a lot of different technologies out there, and it's easy to get caught in the trap of thinking that any one of those technologies is a sort of silver bullet to a transformation. And even more importantly, it's too common that we find that organizations tend to think that it's the technology itself that constitutes a digital transformation. But in reality, digital transformation is driven by whatever technology or technologies make the most sense for an organization. And it's also made up of, or should be comprised of, the people, the process, and the strategic alignment aspects of transformation. So it's really important for us first to understand what transformation means to our organizations. And I would say some of our more successful clients are the ones that are open-minded to really trying to view the technology landscape as a sort of a puzzle. There's a bunch of pieces to the puzzle out in the marketplace, and we need to figure out which pieces of the puzzle make the most sense for our organization and best align with our overall corporate goals and objectives and strategies. And that's what we want to talk about here today, is how do we get that further alignment and further clarity beyond just defining what digital transformation is, how do we define the different components of that as well. And please, as I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to drop in any questions or comments in the chat, and Kyler can certainly stop me at any point along the way, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end as well. But please don't be afraid to interrupt me or to drop questions in the chat, and we can get to those as we go here. So some of the top challenges that organizations face, and this is actually from our 2023 digital transformation report, which we are releasing this week. It's something you can download off of our website. You can also download previous year's transformation reports. But one of the things we found in our research and our experience with clients throughout the world is that there are 5 common challenges that organizations struggle with. And it's usually not the technology itself that creates the biggest problems for clients. So in other words, it's usually not the software itself. It's usually not the configuration and the customization of the software, although there are challenges and risks with that. They typically aren't the biggest challenges that organizations face. Instead, what we often find, or what we more commonly find, is that organizations struggle with things like data migration. That's the number 5 most common challenge that project teams and organizations have stated after the fact. Clarity of business processes is next, in terms of making sure that there's clarity on what the business processes are going to be and what that future state is going to be. And then difficulty managing or addressing deficiencies with the system integrator. That's the number 3 most common thing that challenges struggle with, or that organizations struggle with. So ensuring that they aren't just completely outsourcing and passing the responsibility for the transformation over to the system integrator. That's a common challenge that organizations have. Number 2, which is probably arguably most important to today's conversation, is transformation misalignment with strategic objectives. So in other words, we have a transformation that maybe on paper looks fine, but that transformation is not aligned and does not support or does not enable the bigger picture strategic goals and objectives. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about today, is how do we get that alignment? How do we create a framework, and how do we deploy a framework that allows us to gather that alignment, or to gain that clarity into what our strategic goals and objectives and what our digital strategy to support it might be. And then finally, the number 1 challenge that organizations face is organizational change management in the people part of the transformation. So I have yet to meet a client or an organization or a project team that tells me that the change management piece was easy, or that it was as planned, or that it was easier than they thought. I've yet to meet that client that says that. More often than not, 99.9% of the time, organizations find that change management is a lot harder than they think. And part of that begins with overall internal alignment, but there's a lot more to change management. But certainly what we talk about here today is going to be a key prerequisite to a effective change management strategy, is to make sure you have that alignment first, and then the other change management activities to support the change initiative will enable that as well. So one of the other challenges we see, and this is something else we outline in our 2023 digital transformation report, is that there are more often than not disruptions, operational disruptions to organizations that go through a digital transformation. More often than not, these are short-term operational disruptions, but too often they are longer-term disruptions. And what we find is that over time, we found that year over year, it's hovered right around the 50% mark. Just over 50% of organizations experience some sort of operational material disruption at the time they go live with new technologies as part of their digital transformation. And the significance of that is that it's not just these aren't just minor disruptions like any go live that you would expect, where people are a little bit confused or things slow down temporarily until people get used to the new systems and processes. Here we're talking about more massive or more material operational disruptions. Here's where we're talking about people not being able to ship products, or not being able to close the books, not being able to provide timely financial results. These are fairly material operational disruptions that we're talking about here. And the impact of those disruptions to the organization oftentimes dwarf the initial cost of the implementation. So that's why it's very important to not just look at what your total cost of ownership is from a implementation perspective, in other words, from start of implementation through go live, but the cost after go live is extremely important to make sure you're managing or understanding what the impact might be, because a lot of times organizations make decisions that optimize the initial implementation cost, but they have such severe disruptions to their operations that the overall cost ends up being exponentially more than the initial implementation. And that can range anywhere from 50% to 3 times, plus 50% to plus 3 times or 300% what the initial implementation cost is. And so you really have to look at the overall big picture and the overall long-term total cost of ownership and value before making some of these decisions. And so the things that most strongly impact operational disruption and create some of these challenges that I mentioned is things related to business processes, change management, lack of internal alignment, and lack of time and effort spent during user acceptance and conference room pilots. Those are 4 of the biggest reasons why, or the 4 of the biggest variables that have the biggest impact on whether or not organizations experience this sort of operational disruption. So, these 4 challenges, these 4 areas that are so important to ensuring that you don't have these problems. These 4 areas are things that we'll be covering throughout today's workshop, through this week's or through today's Digital Stratosphere event. So our goal here is to share with you some best practices to help mitigate some of these risks that are mentioned here. And then, just as a quick side note, some of the services we provide to our clients, I didn't mention this in our introduction, but we provide a number of different services to help clients through the entire digital transformation journey. We help them with defining their digital strategy, to evaluating and selecting software, to the implementation, program management, quality assurance, as well as providing business process improvement, organizational change, and implementation readiness support. So our goal, and with most of our clients, we're helping them through their entire digital transformation life cycles. And we certainly provide a good amount of services in terms of helping project recoveries. So ensuring that we help get a client back on track, or help them with their project reset to sort of right size or to get a project back on track. And we also help quite a bit with expert witnesses work. So our expert witness work as well, which is related to lawsuits and litigation as it relates to transformations. And we've been expert witnesses for clients throughout the world in their transformations. We try to take the lessons from providing all these services to clients and sort of distill them in this workshop here today to help you get started on and help you continue with your digital transformation journeys. So we talk about it when we talk about executive alignment and that overall internal strategic alignment that we're trying to gain. It's first important to look at our overarching digital strategy. So understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, what it is we are today, and where we're headed in the future. And we typically do that in the context of 5 major work streams, supported by a 6th one focused on project quality assurance at the bottom. But when you look at these different work streams, these were sort of the beginning points or the focus areas that we need to start with to help get alignment amongst our executive team on what our digital strategy is as an organization. And again, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, it is not a matter of simply picking a technology like an ERP system or a human capital or CRM system, or even some modern artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies or RPA. It's not a matter of choosing a technology and using that as a silver bullet to implement to improve your business. It's not that simple. What organizations tend to do, at least the more successful ones, is they define an overarching digital strategy that aligns with and supports their overarching organizational strategies, goals, and objectives. And the ways they do that is they start to unpack their digital strategies and define their digital strategies in the context of these 5 major work streams that are focused on business process improvement. So looking at current state and migrating to future state. It's also focused on organizational change management, which is the people or the human side of change, beginning with an organizational assessment and diagnostic, and continuing with organizational impact and the overall change strategy to address organizational change. It's also enterprise applications. So looking at what technologies we have today and what technologies we could be using in the future, and not only just the technologies we could be using in the next 1 or 2 years, but how does that technology landscape potentially help us evolve and continue our journey in years to come? So it may be that we have a big picture digital strategy that entails a number of different enterprise applications, but we're not going to necessarily implement those all on day one. We're going to have a more phased or sequential approach to deploying some of those technologies. So that enterprise application space and understanding and aligning on what that means and how technology can support the organization is very important. And again, it's very important not to fall into the trap of thinking we'll just go to Microsoft or SAP or Oracle or whoever the software vendor is. We'll get their latest and greatest product and we'll just go ahead and implement that, and that will constitute our digital strategy. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more options you have technologically, and some of these other work streams are even more important than the technology piece. In addition to enterprise apps, we're looking at solution architecture. So we need to understand how systems tie together internally, externally. Even if you're going with a single or a core set of technologies, you're likely going to have to integrate that technology with other legacy systems or regulatory systems, especially if you're operating in multiple countries within Asia Pacific. You're certainly going to have different regulatory regimes and requirements that are important to address, and that solution architecture is a way to tie together systems across the landscape. And then finally, business intelligence and analytics is another component that's important to look at. Understanding what those reporting requirements are and what that future state is going to be is very important as well. So the power of executive alignment is extremely important. So it's a main pillar to digital transformation success, as I mentioned before. And without that executive buy-in and alignment, it's very likely that any transformation project is going to fail, no matter how well it's executed, no matter how great the technology is, even no matter how well you might handle change management and process improvement and all the non-technical stuff that I mentioned before that's so important. Even if you do that stuff well, if you haven't addressed executive alignment and you don't have executive buy-in and alignment, the project's probably not going to succeed. And I can't even count the number of times that we've had either an expert witness litigation related project and or a project recovery or reset where we had to help a client to get a project back on track. I can't even tell you how many times it had so much to do with executive misalignment. And there's been times where we look at projects and say, you know what, with the backdrop that we have here with the lack of internal alignment, it is probably impossible for that organization to succeed. It really is that difficult to lead and manage change if you don't have that clarity and clear vision and direction for your overall strategy. And if you don't have that executive buy-in, that's a significant challenge as well. And this whole dynamic trickles down to managers, and it's something that should involve managers as we get alignment. That's something that can start to trickle down through the organization, and it gets the rest of the organization aligned. And it's also the catalyst for successful organizational change strategies as well. An engaged executive sponsor can provide enterprise level support, and a feedback loop can address any roadblocks or project challenges as well. So the power of executive alignment is very real, and it's something that's an important prerequisite to ensuring that you have an effective and a successful digital transformation. So another thing or another way to think about strategic alignment and getting that executive alignment is to think about how we articulate the overall strategy of the organization and how we translate the strategy of the organization into a more meaningful and tangible digital strategy. And you can see on the right side of your screen here a sample that I've included a screenshot of, or at least a framework of, is really looking at different aspects of our strategy and things we're trying to accomplish as an organization, and really starting to map out how those different strategies and tactics might align with and support the overall strategic direction in the strategy of the organization. So think of it as almost a translation exercise. Most organizations we work with, in their heads, they have in their heads an understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish as an organization strategically. Not talking about digital strategy, just as an organization, these are the top 5 or 7 goals and objectives we're trying to accomplish for the next 5 or 10 years. This is how we're going to grow as a company. This is our strategy long term. Once we understand that, then we start to unpack it and we start to cascade that down into bits and pieces of a digital strategy that align with and support that overall approach. So, for example, if an organization is really trying to fuel more top-line revenue growth, let's just say they're a more mature, slower growing multinational organization, their goal with their digital transformation and just with their overall organizational goals and objectives might be to really jumpstart and kickstart revenue growth by expanding into new markets or expanding into new products. So then we start thinking about, well, what sorts of technologies would best enable that? What sort of digital strategy and framework would best support revenue growth? And that looks a lot different than an organization that is, say, just going through a bunch of merger and acquisition integration. They're trying to go buy a bunch of companies and they want to integrate into a common business platform and operating model. Those are 2 very different digital strategies with different goals and objectives and different tactics that will be used from a digital strategy perspective. So we have to define the digital strategy and really translate the digital strategy from what the overarching goals and objectives are as an organization. And the strategic articulation is one way to do that. And it's a visual exercise to help start to define at the executive level what those strategies and tactics are. And it's not just the output that's important here. It's not just the output of defining what the goals and objectives of the digital strategy are, but it's also the fact that we're getting aligned as an organization and as a team. We're starting to define things in the same way, with the same language, and we're starting to row in the same direction, and we're starting to get a better understanding of what our digital strategy is and how it best enables and supports our goals and objectives as an organization.
We're in the midst of a conversation talking about executive alignment. We're going to continue that conversation after a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday. We are in the midst of a conversation about executive alignment in digital transformation.
So some of the ways that we continue to unpack and get clarity on this whole concept of strategic and executive alignment, we typically will host a series of articulation workshops and decision workshops where we start to really define and unpack the strategy, as I was talking about on the previous slide, but also make key decisions in terms of what the overall transformation is and what it means to the organization. And so what I've included here is sort of an overview of some of the steps we typically will go through to help clients when they're going through this process here of getting that strategic and executive alignment. So the first thing we do is that strategic articulation workshop, which is actually meant to provide an input to the previous slide, which was the slide that I just showed you here, that gets into the strategic articulation and starts to visualize and starts to translate what some of those goals and objectives are. The second step is we'll then get into more granularity and start to look at key decision criteria workshops. So here's where we will start to make decisions around things as complex as business processes, or ranging from things like business processes to other aspects of a transformation or decisions that need to be made. Things like, do we want a standard set of business processes that are common across the world, or do we want more of a decentralized flexible model. And, you think of all these decisions as not just an either or, but sort of a continuum, and trying to define where we fall on the continuum in the spectrum of these decisions. So in these examples you see here, some of the decisions are, do we have standard common processes, or do we have flexible processes? Do we have, and by the way, you make those decisions for different functional areas throughout the organization. You might have different answers. We also start to define, do we want to use vanilla software off the shelf, or do we want to customize to meet our needs? That's another challenge that we need to address. Do we want to have, another example would be, do we want to have, integrated set of systems, or do we want more of a best of breed approach? Those are just examples of where, we have to have alignment on those sorts of major high-level strategic parameters, or else it's really easy to get misaligned and not agree and not have clarity on where we're headed as an organization. So what we do in these exercises is we will lay these topics of discussion, these decision points on the table, and we'll visually go through an exercise where we start off by visually representing in red in this example, in these examples here. Red is where we are today, and green is where we think we want to go in the executive team, and even broader management teams over time. As we go through iterations of this, we'll start by understanding in red where we think we are today, and you start to look at where on the continuum we are today versus where we think we want to be in the future, and that's the green dots that you see here. And so really our goal then is to look at two things. One is, how well aligned are we on where we are and where we think we're headed? In this case, you can see that we're sort of aligned on the red, which is understanding and clarifying the current state, but we're not very aligned on the future state. Those green dots are sort of all over the entire continuum. And so our job is to figure out, well, how do we get that alignment? How do we make sure that we cluster those dots closer together, and that we're all, in a similar, have a similar view of the world? And this is normal to have different opinions. You want diverse opinions. You want diversity of input into the process. But at the end of the day, you want to ensure that you align and you start going in the right direction. And so we work to align those green dots to somewhere on the dial, or somewhere on the spectrum or continuum, that best supports the overall project. And there's a series of questions and processes we go through to do that. But that's one of the big challenges, or big outputs of this exercise, is to understand and have clarity on where are we in terms of all these different decisions we need to make. And this is just a very small subset of the questions we have to go through with executives, just to give you some examples. The second thing we look at, in addition to making sure that the green and the future state direction is clustered together closer, and that we're all viewing the world similarly, is we also look at how big the gap is between the current state in red and the future state in green. The bigger that gap is, or the bigger that change is, that translates into more risk, more time, more resources that we need to factor into our overall transformation roadmap. And so that's really, part of the value of this. The unintended secondary value of this is that it also ensures that we have an understanding of the magnitude of change, which will allow us to define a transformation strategy and roadmap that's more aligned with reality and what it is we as an organization are trying to accomplish. And then the third step in this process is we identify the gaps, the risks, and the findings, and that we use this to inform our overall digital strategy and roadmap and overall transformation plan. You'll see too, one of the things we use, or one of the frameworks we use in the bottom right corner here, is a graphic that it's very difficult to read. I can't even read it on my screen right now, this screenshot. But what that is that's a screenshot of 13 different dimensions that we typically assess and evaluate risk with transformation projects, beginning with the initial strategy phase all the way through implementation and go live and everything. We use this framework to manage risk and to identify and mitigate risk along the way. And so that's a good way to think about this, is to think about how can you bring in the tools and the resources and the outside help to help you frame this in a way that will help you identify and mitigate risk along the way, and certainly ultimately get to that point where you have that strategic alignment early on in the project. And then finally, as we get through this, we go through recommendations and alignment plan, and then we repeat the process as necessary. I mentioned before that it's a very iterative process. It's not something where you just have a workshop with some executives, you
clarify your overall strategy and you move on. That's what software vendors typically do, because typically what they're trying to do is they're just trying to get to know the business well enough to start building software, which is what they're really good at. But what we need to do as an organization is slow down, make sure that we have that clarity, that we've worked through these decisions, and that we have alignment on these decisions before we start getting into build software. And, a good way to think about everything I'm talking about here today is to really think of this all as sort of a phase 0 two-year transformation project. I know it's tempting to want to just jump in and let's just go pick a software. Let's go start deploying software. And again, that's what software vendors do because that's what they're good at. That's how they make money. But in order for you to be successful, you have to think of your overall transformation project, as a long journey. And you're going to set that aside for a second. That's coming up. It's coming soon. But in the meantime, we need to do this phase 0 where we get this alignment, we get this internal clarity on where it is we're headed. So that we can be more effective when we get to the actual transformation, but B, so that we are sure that we have the right transformation plan and roadmap to begin with. Because more often than not, we just jump right into an implementation plan and resource plan and overall strategy that's not aligned, as we're talking about here today. And when it's not aligned, we don't have a realistic vision of what that implementation really is. So then we end up running into problems like our projects get delayed, we go over budget, people get burned out and stressed out. Those are the sorts of things that we've got to make sure we mitigate. And that's part of how this whole phase 0 and this whole strategic alignment process, which is part of phase 0. There's other things that happen within that. And that's part of what Dean and Wayne will talk about later, are things like defining your target operating model. That's something we'll talk about here after my session, is how do we define that target operating model? And we want to define that target operating model, the future state, in the context of what it is we say we're trying to accomplish strategically as an organization, so that we're not just shooting in the dark, that we actually have a clear plan for that. So that's how this all ties together into the grand scheme of things in the sort of phase 0 mentality of make sure we have a solid strategy and alignment before we start building and deploying technology.
Yeah, and Eric, I think it's a good time to just address some of these questions real quick before we move on. So we have some great questions in our questions and answer queue. You can definitely put them there or put them in the chat. Either way, we're monitoring them. So this is an interesting one. Does Third Stage face any discontent from clients when we say something like, I think you might need to revise your broader corporate vision in your company? And I'll answer that one. Absolutely, yes. But I'll let Eric elaborate on that. So we have some other questions just about executive alignment. So if you can just kind of talk to us about how, as a consultant or as an outside party, how do you have that conversation with your clients in a way that shows legitimacy of that you know the business and that you are that trusted advisor? How does that work?
Well, I think the first thing is to resist the temptation to come in and say that a client is right or wrong. I mean, our job is never to tell a client that they're wrong or they don't know what they're doing or that they have the wrong strategy. Generally, organizations have a pretty clear and effective understanding of what it is they need to accomplish as an organization strategically. So how they're going to grow the company, how they're going to be more profitable, more successful, more effective, all that sort of thing. Sometimes they don't. And obviously we've got to help in those cases and help them articulate the overarching strategy. But more often than not, they know what their general strategy is, but where they fail is they don't translate that strategy into something that matches from a transformation perspective. So in other words, they get caught up in the allure of a hot new technology that they're just going to deploy that's going to solve all their problems and help them achieve all their strategic goals and objectives without really defining, well, how is artificial intelligence, for example, how is artificial intelligence going to help you and align with the overall strategy, and what's the focus of artificial intelligence and where are we going to deploy it? That's just one example of how we might think that through. But in general, yeah, it's more a matter of articulating and translating what they already know to be their corporate goals and objectives into a digital strategy, more so than it is helping them define their organizational strategy in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense in helping them to kind of consume and define their strategic visioning and that alignment process. So keep those questions coming, folks. I will make sure that Eric addresses a lot of them at the end, and we'll move on here to talk more about some granular tactics.
Sure. Sounds good. Thank you. So here's an example, or just a sample of a strategic articulation workshop that we do for clients, and this is where we start to define in some more detail what the overall strategy is, and it's a way that we get to that strategic development and articulation. And to Kyler's point in the question from the audience around, how do you deliver that bad news to clients that they don't have a good strategy, or that they haven't thought through this completely. It's really not necessarily, it's not bad news typically when we're doing this, because the good news is we're helping through the process. Now, I'd say where the bad news comes in is if you haven't thought through these things, you haven't started to make some of these decisions, that's where I would suggest you're going to run into problems if you haven't made some of these decisions as an executive team and gone through the iterations and through some of the pain and the messiness of having to require or having to define what some of these decisions are. So this is where we get into defining that strategy, the critical priorities and initiatives, some of the key decisions that need to be made so that we have some frameworks and parameters to define a transformation roadmap and strategy that fits our business and what it is we're trying to accomplish, and it fits our priorities. It's also a way to confirm alignment and accountability and measure success and mitigate risks and get to next steps that align with the overall strategy. So this sample agenda is something that we do. In this case, this is over a 1-week process. We conducted a series of workshops for this client for this particular iteration or phase of the strategic articulation workshop. So the key here is that we want to take those conceptual models that I talked about in the previous slides that you see summarized on the right side of the screen. You want to start to translate that into more tactical, actionable agenda items within a workshop setting to help get to some of those outputs that will then lead to and provide inputs to other outputs like the digital transformation plan and the overall roadmap and strategy. So I was talking earlier about, some of the examples of decisions we need to make as an organization and decisions that we need to make sure that we're aligned on a team as. So for example, and this comes back to the question that Kyler brought up from the audience a moment ago, which is how do you ensure that a client or an organization has an effective strategy, is you want to make sure that you have just clarity on the strategy, that you're aligned on the strategy, and that the different strategic decisions that we have to make, they should be aligned with and support the overarching corporate or organizational goals and objectives. And that's where you have problems, is when there's a disconnect. I always tell clients that it's better that you have an aligned and clear strategy that's imperfect than to have a perfect strategy that isn't as well defined or isn't as well understood, or that we're not as well aligned on. Even though it might be a superior strategy, the fact that you're not aligned internally means that I'll take the imperfect strategy where there is alignment. That's generally going to be more successful. That's generally going to give you more tailwinds instead of headwinds. And it's going to allow you to reach that third stage of success that we were talking about earlier. And so that begs the question, well, what are these decisions we have to make? If we, do we have to decide on what software vendor we're going to deploy, or do we have to decide on, the phasing strategy of the software? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is even more fundamental and more basic from a strategic level. But we've got to have that basic foundation in place before we can get to some of those other later decisions that we tend to rush into more often than not. So some of those decisions are things like I mentioned before, standard versus flexible processes. And by the way, some of these decisions are decisions that need to be made repeatedly or be made for different parts of the organization. So for example, your finance group might say, we want very standard processes, and we're going to fall on the left side of that spectrum of standard processes versus flexible processes. But when you get to your customer service or your sales group, you might find that, well, that group is going to be a little bit more flexible because we need flexibility to adjust to customer needs, or maybe we have a very customized product, and that customization is what makes us different and sets us apart from our competitors. So therefore, our production, our product lifecycle design, or our production processes might need to be more flexible. Whatever the case may be, we want to define those decisions for different parts of the business. We also have a system strategy. Do we want a single ERP system? Do we want a best of breed? And by the way, for all these decisions, part of our job is to say there is no easy answer here. There's always a trade-off. There's always pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of any one of these decisions. But the key is to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we can rationalize and justify how these decisions support the overarching goals and objectives of the company. And just as importantly, make sure that we're aligned on those decisions. There's also another example is the last one on this slide, which is, we as an organization, do we want to go through massive amounts of change? Or are we more risk adverse? Are we more, maybe we're just more of an organization where slower tempo or more incremental tempo makes more sense? How much change do we really want to take on as an organization? That's a really important question and a really important decision that has to be made, because if we don't have alignment on that, we're going to have unrealistic expectations. You're going to have part of the team that thinks that we should be just taking our time and doing things slowly and incrementally. You have other people that think we should be really aggressive. We should just go all in on this transformation now. And those are two very different strategies with different roadmaps and tactics to support them. So we need to make sure we have that alignment. There's other things around, what kind of system deployment approach do we take? That may sound a bit technical, but it's still something that we need to define as an organization and have clarity on as an organization. Are we going to take a waterfall approach, an agile approach, some sort of mix of both? How much of our data are we going to bring over? How do we want to change our culture? That's a big, massive undertaking, or not in terms of time and resources, but just in terms of, the importance of defining that culture and what we want the culture to be and how much of a change we want it to be. So these are just some examples, some additional examples of decisions that need to be made and things where we need to get alignment and understanding before we get too far into our transformation. And then when we get to the gaps, risks, and findings, typically what we want to do is, give a readout of what we found and where we landed on some of these decisions, but also analyze and identify the risks. What are the risks with what we just decided or what we're in the process of deciding? For example, if we decided that we're leaning very heavily towards a standard model with very vanilla software to support the business processes, we want common business processes across the globe. That's fine. That might be perfectly aligned with what our overarching strategy is as an organization. But now we need to look at the dark side. What are the risks of doing what we just said we're going to do? Now, the good news is we've got common vanilla processes with common vanilla technologies to support those processes. The bad news is now we've just put more pressure on the people side of the equation, and now change management is going to be even a bigger risk than it was before, than it was already. So that doesn't necessarily change our decision, or maybe it does, but even if it doesn't change our decision on where we land on the spectrum of things, now we've got to figure out, okay, what are we going to do from a change perspective to ensure that we're being more comprehensive and that we're addressing these risks that we've now introduced now that we've made these decisions. So there's risk mitigation. That's another really important part of that phase zero part of the transformation, to make sure that we understand those risks so that we have a deployment plan to address those risks and mitigate those risks along the way. And I'm gonna skip through this and just show you. I'll show you right here just a project approach that we took with a recent client. You can ignore the timelines for now. This is more of a mid-sized organization that was not extremely short, but not extremely long a process either. Larger organizations might take more time to go through this process. Smaller organizations might take less time. But generally, this is sort of that process we go through to get that alignment and to use some of these tool sets that we've talked about so far in today's conversation to really leverage these frameworks and to get to the point where we're able to mobilize. We get through the workshops to start to get that alignment with the steerco and with the PMO and with the overall project team. We get to the decisions around the different variables that we need decisions on, and then we have recommendations and a roadmap that come out of that to ensure that we have that roadmap that's in alignment.
Okay, that executive alignment thing is a very important topic, and apologies for the abrupt ending to that session. We actually had a technical issue at the end of it, but that was right at the end when we lost the feed. But all the meat, all the important stuff was captured there. Some good stuff there in that segment. We're going to unpack a couple of those concepts, but first we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 77. We just had this discussion about executive alignment, or we played you this clip about executive alignment from our Digital Stratosphere Asia Pacific event. What were some of your takeaways from that presentation, Kyler?
Yeah, I think the name of it is so important, the power of executive alignment, because I was trying to think, is there something else that could potentially really break down a project besides executive alignment or misalignment? And I think organizational change management has the power to do that, but there are very other few things that really have the absolute power to derail a project in this sense. So I think it's something that is such an important consideration, and also something that's really tough to measure and continue to measure. You know, you may have the alignment of the executive team at the beginning of the project, but what are some tactics that you can continue to kind of put a pulse on? Are we still good? Are we still, moving towards this? Do I still have the engagement and support from the executive team, specifically if there is shifting in stakeholders?
Yeah, there's a few different ways to gather qualitative and quantitative information to get that gauge of whether or not you're aligned. One is going to be the ongoing executive steering committee meetings. I mean, usually in those discussions, because we're usually part of those steering committee meetings with our clients, you start to see and feel and hear where the team is aligned and where it's not. And the good news is it allows you to, it sort of brings to the forefront or brings to the spotlight where those misalignments are. And it gives you something you can go tackle and go facilitate the mitigation of. There's also, a lot of times we'll do individual stakeholder interviews throughout the implementation just to gauge whether or not we're on the same page and going in the same direction. You're always going to find cases where you're not. I think people get a little bit alarmed or panicked when that happens. That's just, if you're part of a big organization, that just is natural. So the question then is, what do you do about it? It's going to happen. So how do we fix it? And then the other part of it too is, we do continue to do, especially for longer and more risky and more complex transformations, we'll do sort of a workshop setting where we actually visualize on a scale where organizations are. We try to quantify on a scale, I should say, where different stakeholders are as it relates to different decisions and parameters for the transformation. So those are a few different ways we handle that.
Interesting. Yeah, that is so important to continue to understand that. And again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is having that expert in the room that can help you identify those red flags from previous experience that you might not have knowledge of, because this isn't what you do every day, which is totally normal. So such a great event. I really encourage everyone to head over to our website. On our events tab, you can see the replay for this free event. We do regional stratospheres, and you can also go to stratosphere2022.com to see our stratosphere event, the bigger 3-day event from earlier this year. And we're looking forward to inviting everyone to our 2023 event, which will be here before you know it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's already that time to start planning for it. So, well, good. Well, thanks for that discussion and some takeaways from that presentation. And just to rehash what you said, you go to stratosphere2022.com. You can listen to that session again, or any of the other sessions we've had at the Stratosphere events. And hopefully you find some good value in that. And I want to thank the audience for being here today and for asking great questions. Again, if you don't mind, give us a like, give us a review, subscribe to the channel or to the podcast, depending on where you're watching or listening. It really helps us not only get the word out, but also helps with the algorithms to push this content out to more people that are like-minded and interested in this topic. So I appreciate any help you have there. Thank you, Kyler, for being here today, and hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next week on Transformation Ground Control.